In the practice exercises from the previous video, we examined the following 4 arguments that all have an if-then statement as the first premise of the argument. 2 of these arguments were valid and 2 were invalid. First, let's recall to ourselves the valid arguments. One of these valid arguments we will call argument 1. Premise 1, if Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Premise 2, Ryan played the lottery. Conclusion, Ryan will lose money. In addition, another one we will call argument 2. It starts with the same initial if-then statement. If Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. But then we are told that because Ryan did not lose money, therefore Ryan did not play the lottery. Now let's have a look at the invalid arguments. Argument 3. If Ryan plays the lottery, he will lose money. Ryan lost money, therefore Ryan played the lottery. And finally, argument 4. If Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Ryan did not play the lottery, therefore Ryan will not lose money. These examples were not chosen at random. Each of these represents a very common form or pattern of argumentation. In the case of 2 of the examples, it's a valid form of argument, and in the case of the other 2 examples, an invalid way of arguing. Thus, the reason these examples are important is not because of their specific content. That is, we don't really care about Ryan's misadventures with the lottery. Rather, the reason these are important is because of the underlying logical structure that is featured by each of these arguments. That is, these examples matter because of the argument form that they take. And we will define an argument form as the following. An argument form is a pattern of valid or invalid reasoning that is identified and classified because of its common occurrence in argumentation. To understand what I mean by an argument form, let's consider again argument 1. Premise 1, if Ryan plays the lottery, he will lose money. Ryan played the lottery, therefore Ryan will lose money. The underlying structure of this argument can be expressed as the following. If P then Q, P, therefore Q. Now any argument that takes this form, no matter the specific content of the argument or the topic it addresses, will be said to share this form of argument if it has this underlying structure. In fact, this particular argument form, if P then Q, P, therefore Q, is one of the most common and prevalent forms of argument not only in philosophy, but in all areas of life. For example, it is rather common to think, I need to go to the store because my fridge is empty. And when you say this to yourself, there is an implied, although usually unstated, argument at work here. And what is this argument? Well, it would go something like this. Premise 1, if my fridge is empty, then I need to go to the store. Premise 2, my fridge is empty. Conclusion, I need to go to the store. This form of reasoning pervades nearly every aspect of our lives. Now, because certain forms of argument are just so ubiquitous, it is useful to be able to understand and identify those forms of argument. In some cases, doing so lets us know that whatever we think about the truth of the premises, we at least know that the inference the argument makes is valid. In other cases, doing so shows us that the structure of the reasoning itself is problematic. As such, this video will cover 4 common argument forms that involve or feature if-then statements. 2 of these forms are valid and should be embraced, while 2 of these are invalid and should be avoided. It should also be stated that there are many other forms of argument besides these 4 that we will discuss in this video. However, because of how common these 4 forms of argument are in philosophical writing, it is worth our time to pay them special attention. In philosophy, there is a technical term for the if-then statement like those featured in arguments 1 through 4. Philosophers called these kinds of statements conditionals. Therefore, in order to understand these common argument forms, we first need to gain a better understanding of what is meant by a conditional statement. And in fact, before doing that, we first need to get a better idea of how conditional statements are structured. So, conditional statements typically take the following form. If P then Q, where P is called the antecedent and Q is called the consequent. So, every conditional statement has two parts, an antecedent and a consequent. To better understand this point, let's consider the conditional statement that was found in arguments 1 through 4. If Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. In this case, Ryan plays the lottery is called the antecedent, while he will lose money is referred to as the consequent. But what do conditional statements mean? If we know that some conditional statement is true, then what have we learned exactly? Conditional statements imply the truth of the following two claims. One, that the antecedent is a sufficient condition for the consequent, and two, that the consequent is a necessary condition for the antecedent. So, suppose we have the conditional statement, if P then Q. What this statement is telling us is that P is a sufficient condition for Q, and it is also telling us that Q is a necessary condition for P. This explanation of the meaning of conditional statements appeals to the concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions. So, in order for this explanation to be of any use to you, we will need to explain the difference between these two types of conditions. And let's begin with an explanation first of sufficient conditions. Suppose we know that P is a sufficient condition for Q. This means that the truth of P guarantees the truth of Q. So, if P is true, then nothing else needs to be true in order for Q to be true as well. In other words, the truth of P alone is enough to ensure or guarantee that Q is true. Another way to think about it is this. If you discover that P is true, and P is a sufficient condition for Q, then you have all the information you would need to know to also conclude that Q is true as well. An example can help to clarify this point. Living in Cincinnati, Ohio is a sufficient condition for living in the state of Ohio. To see this, imagine you knew nothing about some person except that the person is named Smith and that this person lives in Cincinnati, Ohio. With only this information, there would be many things you would still not know about Smith. You would not know if he was married or single, a Democrat or Republican, a college student or a senior citizen, whether he enjoys board games or climbing mountains. You wouldn't know any of that. However, even with this very minimal information, you would at least know that it is true that Smith lives in Ohio. The reason for this is because the information that he lives in Cincinnati is sufficient for you to conclude that he lives in Ohio. Cincinnati is a city in the state of Ohio, so Smith could not possibly both live in Cincinnati and also live in some other state. The fact that he lives in Cincinnati guarantees that he lives in Ohio. Consider some other examples of sufficient conditions. Rainy weather is a sufficient condition for the grass being wet. If we are on vacation and our neighbor tells us it is raining, then we know that our lawn is getting some much needed water. Or a geometrical figure being a triangle is a sufficient condition for that figure having three sides. It is the very definition of a triangle that it must have three sides. So we know that any figure we are looking at that is a triangle is guaranteed to have three sides. Completing all the university's graduation requirements is a sufficient condition for earning a bachelor's degree. If you know your friend has completed all graduation requirements, then you know she will get to walk across the stage, although you may not have any idea about how much she learned or what her GPA is. Finally, getting a majority of votes in the Senate is a sufficient condition for a bill to pass on to the president for a signature. According to the rules, bills that pass with a majority get sent to the president for consideration. So if the rules are followed, then the majority vote guarantees that the president will have a decision to make about the bill in question. Now let's consider necessary conditions. Suppose we know that Q is a necessary condition for P. This implies that it is impossible for P to be true without Q being true. In other words, the truth of P depends upon the truth of Q. Q is necessary for P such that the falsity of Q guarantees the falsity of P. To put it another way, if we know that Q is false, then we have all the information we need to also conclude that P must be false. Let's look at an example to see this point. Living in the state of Ohio is a necessary condition for living in Cincinnati, Ohio. Again, suppose the only thing you knew about Smith is that he did not live in Ohio. You still would not know anything about his interests or his hobbies or his political beliefs, but you would know that he does not live in Cincinnati. And how would you know this? Well, it's because living in Ohio is necessary for living in Cincinnati. You cannot live in Cincinnati without living in Ohio precisely because Cincinnati is a city in Ohio. Now, in addition, notice that while living in Ohio is a necessary condition for living in Cincinnati, it is not a sufficient condition for living in Cincinnati. If all you know about Smith is that he lived in Ohio, you would not be able to draw any conclusion about what particular city he lived in. Maybe he lives in Cincinnati, maybe he lives in Columbus or Dayton or Cleveland. So living in Ohio is a necessary but not sufficient condition for living in Cincinnati. Some further examples can also illustrate this point. Saying something untrue is a necessary condition for telling a lie. You definitely did not tell a lie if you said nothing untrue. However, simply saying something untrue is not sufficient for us to know that you told a lie. It would also have to be the case that you know what you're saying is false. If you think that the false thing you are saying is actually true, then you are confused, but you are not lying. This means that saying something untrue is necessary, but not sufficient for telling a lie. Now let's consider a second statement. Completing all the exams in the class is a necessary condition for passing the class. You won't pass the class if you fail to take the exams. However, not even this will be enough to guarantee you pass. It is still possible that you do very poorly on the exams or that you do not submit the other assignments in the class. So this means completing the exams is necessary but not sufficient for passing. Consider a third example. Killing another person is a necessary condition for committing first-degree murder. Certainly, first-degree murder does require that you kill another person. However, it also requires premeditation. It requires that the act of killing was planned out in advance and not just on the spur of the moment. Therefore, killing another person is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for first-degree murder. Finally, let's consider example 4. Completing all general education requirements is a necessary condition for earning a bachelor's degree from the university. The university will not give you a degree if you do not complete your general education requirements, but you obviously have to complete the other requirements for your major as well if you're going to graduate. Therefore, this means that completing the general education requirements is necessary, but it is not sufficient for earning your bachelor's degree. With these explanations in place, we can now better understand what the conditional statement from arguments 1 through 4 means or what that statement is claiming. Recall that the statement says, if Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. This statement is claiming two things. First, the statement claims that Ryan playing the lottery is a sufficient condition for Ryan losing money. So what this means is that if we know that Ryan played the lottery, then we know everything we need to know to conclude that Ryan will also lose money. Second, the statement claims that Ryan losing money is a necessary condition for Ryan playing the lottery. If we know that Ryan did not lose any money, then we also know that Ryan did not play the lottery. These are the two claims that are made by this particular conditional statement. There is one final point to make about conditionals. As we have seen, the most common way to express a conditional in English is the if-then formulation. However, that does not mean that there are not also other ways to express conditionals. In fact, there are many ways to do so that we will not be able to cover here. Still, it will be helpful to cover one additional common English formulation that expresses a conditional statement. Imagine, for example, that we want to make the following claims. We want to say that 1, graduating from the university is a sufficient condition for completing all general education requirements. And 2, we also want to say that completing all general education requirements is a necessary condition for graduating from the university. Now, there are two ways that we might say this. First, we might use the familiar if-then formulation. We might say that if the student graduated from the university, then the student completed all general education requirements. Now, this if-then formulation will always be an acceptable way to express a conditional. However, there are times when using this formulation can be a more or less natural means of expressing our intended meaning. In comparison to the only if formulation that we will discuss shortly, the if-then formulation most naturally expresses the idea that the antecedent is a sufficient condition for the consequent. So if the point you really want to emphasize is that graduating from the university guarantees that you must have completed all general education requirements, then this is a formulation that would make sense and express that idea well. Now let's consider a second English formulation that expresses the same logical meaning, but in a different way. Consider a formulation of this conditional as an only if statement. The student will graduate from university only if the student completes all general education requirements. In this case, the antecedent of the conditional comes before the only if, and the consequent comes after the only if. Now, it is important to emphasize that there is no difference of logical meaning between the if-then and only if versions of this conditional statement. They mean exactly the same thing from a logical point of view. However, again, one or the other can be more effective depending on what you would like to emphasize about the statement. In the case of the only if formulation, using only if places greater emphasis on the fact that the consequent is a necessary condition of the antecedent. So if you want to primarily convey that the student will not be able to graduate without completing the general education requirements, then using the only if formulation would be a good choice. For our purposes, the reason I bring up both of these formulations is because both are common in philosophical writing, and I will use both when outlining the arguments from our readings in my lecture videos. As such, it will be important to be able to recognize that both of these formulations, if then and only if, convey the meaning of a conditional statement. Now that we have an understanding of the meaning of conditional statements, we can consider the four common forms of argument, whether valid or invalid, that feature a conditional as one of the premises. The first of these forms we will consider is called Modus Ponens. Modus Ponens is a Latin phrase that stands for the way that affirms by affirming, and it is a valid argument form in which the consequent of some conditional is concluded to be true because the antecedent of that conditional is true. The logical structure of a Modus Ponens argument is the following. Premise 1, if P then Q. Premise 2, P, conclusion, Q. So, a Modus Ponens argument takes some conditional, affirms that the antecedent of that conditional is true, and thus concludes that the consequence of the conditional must be true as well. You should recognize this as a valid form of argument. Furthermore, now that we understand necessary and sufficient conditions, we can explain why this form of argument is in fact valid. The conditional if P then Q implies that P is a sufficient condition for Q. So this means that if we know that P is true, then that is all we need to know in order to conclude that Q is true also. Because the second premise affirms that P is true, the second premise affirms the antecedent of the conditional in premise 1, it necessarily follows in the conclusion that Q must be true. Let's consider two valid arguments that take the Modus Ponens form. The first example is one of our original four examples. Argument 1. If Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Ryan did play the lottery, therefore Ryan will lose money. The first premise establishes that Ryan playing the lottery is a sufficient condition for him losing money. Therefore, since premise 2 affirms that Ryan played the lottery, it follows validly that Ryan is going to lose money. Now consider a second example. Argument 5. If suffering exists, then there is evil in the world. Suffering does exist, therefore there is evil in the world. In this argument, the conditional premise establishes that the existence of suffering is a sufficient condition for the presence of evil in the world. So if we know there is suffering, then we have enough information to know that there is also evil. Then the second premise affirms that there is in fact suffering, and so from this it follows that there must be evil in the world. Modus Ponens is one of the most commonly used valid forms of argument. Unfortunately, it is often confused with another invalid form of argument. This form of argument is the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent. What is affirming the consequent? Affirming the consequent is an invalid argument form in which the antecedent of some conditional is concluded to be true because the consequent of that conditional is true. We can better understand this definition by examining the logical structure of the argument. Just like Modus Ponens, one premise of the argument is a conditional statement. If P, then Q. However, then instead of affirming the antecedent of that conditional, as is the case in Modus Ponens, the argument affirms the consequent of the conditional. That is, P2 tells us that Q is true. Finally, it is concluded that P is true on this basis. So whereas Modus Ponens concludes that Q is true because P is true, affirming the consequent does precisely the opposite. It concludes that the antecedent P is true because the consequent Q is true. Just like any argument, no matter its content, that takes the form of Modus Ponens will be valid, so any argument, again, no matter its content, that affirms the consequent will always be invalid. Furthermore, we can now better explain why this argument is invalid by using the concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions. The conditional if P then Q implies that Q is a necessary condition for P. However, it does not imply that Q is a sufficient condition for P. Premise 1 tells us that P cannot be true without Q being true. but it does not tell us that the truth of Q guarantees the truth of P. So even if we know that Q is true, that is not enough information to infer that P must be the case as well. Yet, that is precisely the inference that is made by this argument and any argument that affirms the consequent. By concluding that P must be true just because Q is true, the argument seems to assume that Q is a sufficient condition for P. But that is just not what the first premise of the argument tells us. Therefore, this is an invalid argument. Some examples will help to clarify this concept. Again, one of the original 4 arguments with conditionals takes this invalid form. Recall that argument 3 states, if Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. Ryan lost money, therefore Ryan played the lottery. The conditional establishes that Ryan losing money is necessary for Ryan playing the lottery. If we know that Ryan lost no money, then that means we also know that he did not play the lottery. However, that does not mean that Ryan losing money is a sufficient condition for Ryan playing the lottery. As we have already discussed in a previous video, there are many other ways in which Ryan could have lost money besides the lottery. If all you know is that Ryan lost money, this means you cannot yet conclude that Ryan played the lottery. Yet this is exactly what the argument aims to infer. Therefore, this argument and all arguments that affirm the consequent are invalid. Consider a second example. If the weather is rainy, then our lawn will be wet. Our lawn is wet, therefore the weather is rainy. Again, premise 1 establishes only that the lawn being wet is a necessary condition for the weather being rainy, but not that it is a sufficient condition. The first premise does not claim that the wetness of the lawn is sufficient evidence to infer that the weather is rainy. It is consistent with that first premise that the lawn is wet because, for instance, our neighbor watered it for us while we were away. Given all of this, we can say that the argument is invalid. We have seen that affirming the consequent is an invalid argument form. But why is it often convincing if it is invalid? Why is this form of argument often confused with the valid form of argument, Modus Ponens? I believe it has to do with insufficient attention being paid to the conditional if-then statement of the argument. The conditional premise suggests to our mind that there is some kind of relationship between the antecedent and the consequent. And if we are not careful, we might think that the relationship is such that the truth of any one of these always implies the truth of the other. It can be tempting to think that the conditional is claiming that losing money is always tied to playing the lottery, or that the lawn being wet always means that there was rain that day. But as stated, the conditional premise of these arguments does not imply that meaning. It implies that the consequent is necessary for the antecedent, but not that the consequent is sufficient for the antecedent. What this shows is that when evaluating an argument that has a conditional, and there will be many of these in philosophical arguments, it is crucial to pay close attention to the concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions and the specific meaning that is being conveyed by that statement. In order to reinforce the difference between these argument forms, I want to take a look at a real example that comes from a court case entitled City of Green Ridge v. Kreisel. Kreisel operated a junkyard in Green Ridge, Missouri. The city of Green Ridge wanted to regulate that junkyard under an ordinance called Ordinance 477. The conflict arose because Kreisel did not think that the city had the right to regulate his junkyard under that specific ordinance. He claimed that this was because Ordinance 77 was a zoning ordinance, and so was not applicable to his particular establishment. So the case largely turned on whether Ordinance 477 should be considered a zoning ordinance or whether it shouldn't be. Now, there are a number of details of this case that need not concern us here. The main takeaway that we need to consider is the following. If Ordinance 477 is a zoning ordinance, then we know that Kreisel will win the case. By contrast, if 477 is not a zoning ordinance, then the city will win the case. The following is a description of the argument that Kreisel made in court. Since zoning ordinances regulate health and safety through regulating the use of buildings, and since this ordinance addresses health and safety in his operation of the junkyard, therefore, this ordinance is a zoning ordinance. Now, is this a good argument? Well, the first thing we need to do is to put the argument into standard form. Let's begin with the first statement in the argument description. Since zoning ordinances regulate health and safety through regulating the use of buildings. The first thing we should notice here is the premise indicator since. This tells us that what we are looking at here is a premise of the argument. Now you will notice that in the argument outline, I've written this statement as a conditional in the if-then form. You might wonder, why is this? As the argument is written, the statement takes neither the if-then formulation nor the only if formulation. So why is this statement a conditional? Well, consider what this statement is saying. It is telling us something that we can conclude from the fact that some ordinance is a zoning ordinance. Namely, if we know that some ordinance is a zoning ordinance, then we know that it regulates health and safety. This means that being a zoning ordinance is a sufficient condition for being an ordinance that regulates health and safety. And of course, this is precisely what is claimed in a conditional. As such, I have written this statement in the if-then conditional format. This is a good example of how, even though if-then and only if are common ways of expressing conditionals, there are many different ways in which a conditional can be expressed in the English language. Now that we have identified the conditional premise of the argument, I want you to attempt to complete the rest of the argument outline. So, pause this video, determine the second premise and conclusion of the argument, then restart the video, and I will explain the correct argument outline. Let's start by identifying the conclusion of the argument. We should notice the conclusion indicator, therefore, which is referring to the statement, this is a zoning ordinance. So, the conclusion of the argument is that Ordinance 477 is a zoning ordinance. Of course, this makes sense given that in order to win the case, Kreisel needed to demonstrate that 477 is, in fact, a zoning ordinance. This leaves only one remaining statement. This ordinance addresses health and safety in the operation of the junkyard. The claim here is that Ordinance 77 regulates health and safety. Notice the premise indicator since. Although certainly we can infer that this is a premise from process of elimination, this does reinforce the fact that this claim serves as the second premise of the argument. So now we have a complete outline of Kreisel's argument. If Ordinance 477 is a zoning ordinance, then Ordinance 477 regulates health and safety. Ordinance 477 does regulate health and safety, therefore Ordinance 477 is a zoning ordinance. What I want you to do now is determine whether the argument is valid or invalid, and determine whether the argument follows the modus ponens or affirming the consequent logical structure. Pause this video, take a moment to think about your answer, and then restart the video when you are ready for me to explain the correct response. The argument that Kreisel makes here is invalid, and it is invalid because it commits the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent. Premise 1 tells us that regulating health and safety is a necessary condition for being a zoning ordinance. But importantly, it does not tell us that it is a sufficient condition. Then, P2 claims that the consequent of that conditional is true, and the argument draws the conclusion on this basis that the antecedent of the conditional must also be true. Of course, this is precisely the invalid form of argument that characterizes affirming the consequent. As such, this argument is invalid. In his commentary on this case, Stephen Rice gives further explanation of why this argument is invalid. He fails to recognize that while zoning ordinances may address health and safety issues, other types of ordinances may also address health and safety issues without becoming zoning ordinances. In other words, the mere fact that a purpose of zoning ordinances is to regulate public safety does not mean that all ordinances which regulate health and safety are zoning ordinances. To the contrary, there are many other kinds of ordinances which also regulate public health and safety. It is important to recognize here just how powerful the ability to spot this fallacy is. I am guessing you probably do not know anything about this obscure court case, the legal restrictions on junkyards, or the particular laws and ordinances that are on the books in Green Ridge, Missouri. However, even without any of that information, you can safely conclude that this is a bad argument, an argument that a judge should not find convincing. This is because, of course, validity and invalidity have to do with the logical structure of an argument and not the content of the argument. In this case, the content of the argument simply does not matter. This example demonstrates how understanding the nature of logic, argument, and inference can help us to avoid being taken in by faulty reasoning that at a surface level may sound convincing. The third form of argument we will examine is a valid form of argumentation that is known as modus tollens. Modus tollens is a Latin phrase that means the way that denies by denying. It is a valid argument form in which the antecedent of some conditional is concluded to be false because the consequent of that conditional is false. Once again, let's consider the logical structure of this form of argument. A modus tollens argument reasons in the following fashion. The first premise tells us that if P is true, then Q is true. Then it is claimed that Q is not true or that Q is false. Importantly, this means that the second premise of the argument is denying the consequent of the original conditional. The second premise holds that the consequent of that conditional is false. And so from this, it is concluded that P is not true or that P is false. So why is this a valid form of argument? Here the crucial point to realize is that the first premise tells us that Q is a necessary condition for P. This means that if we know Q is false, then we also know that P is false. Furthermore, the second premise establishes that, in fact, Q is false. And from this, it follows validly that P must be false as well. The previously discussed argument 2 is an example of the modus tollens argument form. If Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. This means that because losing money is a necessary condition for playing the lottery, that we know if Ryan lost no money, then he also did not play the lottery. Now, because premise 2 denies that Ryan lost any money, the valid inference here is that Ryan did not play the lottery. Because the consequent of the conditional in P1 is false, it follows that the antecedent of the conditional in P1 must also be false. Therefore, here we are looking at a valid argument. Consider an additional example. Argument 7. Human life is meaningful only if human beings are immortal. Human beings are not immortal, therefore, human life is not meaningful. The first thing to notice about this example is that it uses the only if formulation for expressing a conditional. Recall that the logical meaning of this statement is no different than if the premise was written as if human life is meaningful, then human beings are immortal. It is still a conditional statement. And in this case, human beings are immortal is the consequent, while human life is meaningful is the antecedent. Now, how do we know that this is a valid argument? Well, if human beings are immortal is the consequent of this conditional, then human beings being immortal is a necessary condition for human life to be meaningful. However, P2 establishes that this necessary condition is not met. It just is not true that human beings are immortal. Therefore, it follows validly from these premises that human life is not meaningful. Just as there is an invalid form of argument, namely affirming the consequent, that is often mistaken for modus ponens, so there is also an invalid form of argument that is often confused with modus tollens. This invalid argument form is known as denying the antecedent. Denying the antecedent is an invalid argument form in which the consequent of some conditional is concluded to be false because the antecedent of that conditional is claimed to be false. Just as affirming the consequent is exactly the opposite of modus ponens, so denying the antecedent is exactly the opposite of modus tollens. Instead of concluding that the antecedent of a conditional must be false because the consequent of that conditional is false, as in the case of modus tollens, an argument that denies the antecedent concludes that the consequent of a conditional must be false because the antecedent of that conditional is false. We can see this by examining the underlying logical structure of this form of argument. First, we have the conditional if P then Q. Then the second premise claims that the antecedent of that conditional P is false. And the conclusion drawn is that the consequent of that conditional Q must also be false. The reason this argument is invalid is, once again, that it confuses necessary and sufficient conditions. In this argument, P is a sufficient condition for Q. The truth of P guarantees the truth of Q. But of course, P is not a necessary condition for Q. It is not the case that P must be true in order for Q to be true. Q could be true in some other way even if P is actually false. Yet, this argument treats P as if it were a necessary condition for Q. It assumes that without P being true, that Q cannot be true. But that just is not the case. So, even if, as claimed in premise 2, we know that P is false, that does not mean that Q is necessarily false. So, this is an invalid argument form. Argument 4 commits this error of denying the antecedent. The argument reasons, if Ryan plays the lottery, then he will lose money. But Ryan did not play the lottery, so Ryan will not lose money. This is faulty logic because playing the lottery is only a sufficient condition for losing money. Playing the lottery guarantees that Ryan will lose money, but it is not necessarily the only way in which Ryan might lose money. Thus, it is invalid to infer that Ryan didn't lose any money just because he didn't play the lottery. Another example of this can be seen in argument 8. If the star player fully recovers from the injury, then the home team will win the championship. The star player has not fully recovered from the injury, thus, the home team will not win the championship. We might be able to have full confidence that the home team will become champions if the star player recovers, but that does not necessarily mean that the home team needs their star player to win. Perhaps they have capable reserves, maybe there is a future star waiting in the wings for an opportunity to prove him or herself. But according to P1, the services of the star player are sufficient for victory. However, they are not necessary. So for that reason, this would be an invalid argument. For further illustration of these argument forms, I want to examine an argument that is considered by Alan Turing in his famous paper entitled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. In this paper, Turing considers the topic of artificial intelligence, and in particular, he asks the question, can machines think? In the course of answering this question, Turing outlines a test, now known as the Turing test, which he believes would let us determine whether some artificial system or program qualifies as being intelligent. Since the publication of this paper in 1950, multiple computer programs have been able to pass the Turing test, although there is still debate among philosophers today about whether this really shows that these programs are intelligent machines that are really capable of thought. Now, at the end of his paper, Turing considers a number of objections to the idea that it would be possible for a machine to think. These objections do not represent Turing's own view, but are arguments he imagines that someone might make against him. And one of these arguments Turing referred to as the argument from informality of behavior. The argument reasons as follows. If each man had a definite set of rules of conduct by which he regulated his life, he would be no better than a machine. But there are no such rules, so men cannot be machines. Is this a good argument? Once again, let's begin by putting the argument into standard form. We should notice that the first sentence of this argument is a conditional statement. I have rendered this first premise of the argument as follows. If human conduct was governed by a definite set of rules, then humans would be equivalent to machines, or as Turing puts it, no better than machines. The idea here is this. Imagine that human behavior was governed by a specific set of rules that determine precisely what a person will do in every conceivable situation. For instance, if it is a rainy Tuesday afternoon and Ryan just had a disagreement with his wife, then he will act disgruntled toward anyone he sees walking down the sidewalk. Or if Ryan sleeps at least 7 hours and feels optimistic about the state of the world, then he will buy a lottery ticket. We will imagine that there's a similar set of rules for every conceivable situation that a human being might find him or herself in. Now, if it were true that all human behavior for all human beings could be specified and predicted in this way, then what would that imply about human beings? Wouldn't it mean that human beings are mere robots or machines? It seems like a hallmark of human life is the ability to make free choices, while what defines a machine is that it is entirely governed by the rules that specify what outputs will occur given certain inputs. But if human freedom is an illusion, if all human behavior really could be described in a set of rules, and consequently predicted with perfect accuracy, then it does not seem there would be any real difference between humans and machines. That is the claim made by the first premise of the argument. So we can see that the first premise of the argument is this conditional. Now, what I want you to do is pause this video and complete the rest of the argument outline. Then, when you have done this, restart the video and I will explain the answer. We can begin by identifying the conclusion of the argument. Here we should notice the conclusion indicator so. This indicator tells us that the intended conclusion of the argument is that humans are not equivalent to machines or humans are no better than machines. Now, from what premise is this conclusion drawn? The only remaining statement is the claim that there are no such rules. I have expanded on this in the argument outline by rendering this statement as human conduct cannot be governed by a definite set of rules. Now, why would someone believe that this premise is true? Turing provides the following explanation. He tells us that it is not possible to produce a set of rules purporting to describe what a man should do in every conceivable set of circumstances. One might, for instance, have a rule that one is to stop when one sees a red traffic light and to go if one sees a green one. But what if by some fault both appear together? One may perhaps decide that it is safest to stop, but some further difficulty may well arise from this decision later. To attempt to provide rules of conduct to cover every eventuality, even those arising from traffic lights, appears to be impossible. His point here is that the utter complexity of human decision making precludes the possibility of us being able to outline a precise set of rules by which all human behavior can be determined. Now, perhaps an all-powerful, godlike intellect could do this, but of course that is not the human intellect. Therefore, the idea is that human behavior simply cannot be encapsulated into some definite set of rules. Now we have a complete outline of the argument. So, is this argument valid or invalid? And does the argument take the form of Modus Tollens, or is it an example of denying the antecedent? What I want you to do is pause the video, answer these questions, and then restart the video when you are ready for me to explain the answer. I think there are some good reasons to question whether both premises of this argument really are true. However, without getting into any of those issues, we can say that this is a bad argument because it is invalid. Specifically, this argument commits the error of denying the antecedent. The first premise establishes that human conduct being governed by definite rules is a sufficient condition for human beings being equivalent to machines. However, this premise does not establish that human conduct being governed by rules is a necessary condition. That is, according to P1, even if human conduct were not entirely rule-governed, we might have other reasons to think that humans are equivalent to or no better than machines. Yet the argument unfortunately treats human conduct being rule-governed as a necessary condition instead of a sufficient condition. The inference being made is that just because human conduct is not entirely rule-governed, that humans must not be equivalent to machines. However, for the reasons just stated, this conclusion does not follow validly. So, the argument is invalid. To further understand why the ability to identify the rules that govern behavior is not necessary for something to be a machine, and to see why this instance of denying the antecedent is invalid, we can consider the following example given by Turing. Turing states, suppose we could be sure of finding such laws, the laws that govern behavior, if they existed. Then, given a machine, it should certainly be possible to discover by observation sufficient about it to predict its future behavior, and this within a reasonable time, say 1,000 years. But this does not seem to be the case. I have set up on the Manchester computer a small program using only 1,000 units of storage, whereby the machine supplied with one 16-figure number replies with another within 2 seconds. I would defy anyone to learn from these replies sufficient about the program to be able to predict any replies to untried values. His point here is that we all accept that the behavior of machines is entirely rule-governed. However, that does not mean that we will necessarily be able to predict how a machine will behave with complete confidence in every situation, especially as machines themselves become more and more advanced and autonomous. Turing does not even believe that we would be able to specify all the rules that govern the relatively simple program he has set up, which provides 16-figure numbers. Given this, the mere fact that we cannot specify the rules that govern human behavior does not mean that no rules exist, or that human beings do not ultimately behave in a rule-governed and machine-like fashion. In this video, we've considered two common valid forms of argument, Modus Ponens and Modus Tollens, as well as two invalid forms of argumentative error, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. Understanding these forms of argument is important in both cases. Modus Ponens and Modus Tollens represent probably the two most prevalent methods of reasoning in philosophical argument, and we will see them repeatedly in this class. In addition, we have seen how being able to identify the fallacies of affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent allows us to determine that an argument is faulty even without knowing anything about the specific content of that argument. This is a very powerful skill to have. While these patterns of argument are foundational not just to philosophical reasoning but to reasoning in general, they can also be difficult to grasp and identify when first introduced. For this reason, in the next video, we will cover some practice exercises that will reinforce your understanding of these fundamental argument forms.